In this video, we're going to be talking about the stock wizard and machine setup from inside of BobCAM for Rhino. Now, with this example, I'm going to be setting it up as if it's a milling example, but the milling, the mill turn, and the wire EDM are all the exact same type of setup. The thing with lathe is you don't really vary how you set your parts up. Your part's always going to be set up with the front face of your turning part kind of right here at the XY location, or really it's XZ when we get into turning, but we can adjust that. And we'll look at an example of a turning tutorial later on. Now, for stock wizard and machine setup, this is where we're going to define the material that we're cutting our part from and where our tools are zeroed out from on that part. So to get into the stock wizard and machine setup, the first thing we have to do is start a new job. So I'm going to right click on CAM defaults here and say new job. Now from here, I could either go directly into the stock wizard, or I can hit OK and I can go into the stock wizard later on. But you have to create the stock before BobCAM will allow you to even create a toolpath. So I'm going to go right into the stock wizard. Now, if you go right into the stock wizard, it's going to ask you to select a workpiece. If you were to hit OK and then launch the stock wizard later on, it's not going to ask you to select this workpiece. And you do not have to pick a workpiece for a job. The workpiece is something that we use inside the simulation to compare this solid model, this kind of finished part, to what we're actually cutting inside of BobCAM. So what our toolpaths are actually showing. And all we do with this one is we go in and we pick a solid model that represents the final part. Now the big thing here is we have no control over the filters down at the bottom as to what gets used. So you need to make sure that curves and surfaces and poly surfaces and meshes, depending on what you're using, you're gonna need to make sure those are turned on. Otherwise, we essentially just don't see them. You can click on them, but if you don't have surfaces turned on, we can't pick surfaces. So after we pick that workpiece, we're not gonna hit OK, we're just gonna hit the next arrow right here into the stock wizard. Now for milling, wire EDM, and the mill turn, we have 6 different types of stock. So I'm going to run through a couple examples here. The first one is a rectangular piece of stock, where we make a rectangular piece of stock that fits right around our part. So it matches the exact size. So in this case, it's 6 by 6 by 3.5 tall. We could also create cylindrical stock. So cylindrical stock allows me to say I want to use a bounding cylinder, and I want to calculate my stock, and that's actually letting us fit a piece of stock that is cylindrical to the size of the part. So we'll see that it's 6 inches in diameter, 3.5 inches tall. Wireframe allows me to actually go in and pick a wireframe portion of the part. So I'm going to use Control Shift and I'm going to click on the edge, and then I'll go ahead and choose my poly surface boundary here, or just the edge, whichever one we want to use. And that's going to allow me to say calculate some stock. So if I calculate that, we'll see that I now have a piece of stock that's floating at the top of the part, at the top where we have 0. And then I can actually tell it how tall to make it. So I'll say 3.5 inches. And it's going to create this piece of stock. And that's really good for odd shaped parts that maybe you've already done some machining on, or maybe a part that's been extruded and you need to go add some features back into it. The next 3 we really don't have a good example for here. The first one's a solid model, and the second one's an STL file, which when you're working with them as stock, they're essentially the same thing. A solid model that's open inside your drawing window, you can select it, it represents your stock. The big difference is between a solid model where, again, you'd have a solid model open and that represents the stock. An STL file is a file that you can browse for. So instead of having that model already open, we can just reference that STL file as a piece of stock. And then the last one is a revolved piece of stock. This is something I primarily use with either lathe if I've already done some turning on a part, or maybe it showed up with some turning already done, or mill turn. Again, same situation. Maybe I have a piece of stock that's already been cut in some way. This allows me to pick a wireframe for a part and then revolve it into the stock that we want. So for this one, I'm going to choose rectangular stock, and realistically, I'd probably use a circular piece of stock for this, but with rectangular stock, I could say calculate the stock. It makes a piece of stock that's big enough to fit the entire piece of geometry. And then right down here, we have our stock orientation. This is used for rotating our stock to make our stock match the way that our part opened up. So if our part ever opens up or the way we draw it opens up and it's not sitting nice and square to our XY here, then we can actually orient the stock to match the part. Or we can try and lay the part down so it sits flat. So most of the time, if you're just opening a part, you're importing a model, or you're drawing a model, you probably don't need to mess with the stock orientation. And the reason I point this out, even though we're not using it, is because it's very similar looking to what we'll see on the next page, which is the origin picking for our stock. So we don't want to get confused with this. This allows us to change the orientation of the stock. This is still all part of the stock definition. What I want to do is go down to the bottom and hit next or forward so that these points show up on my screen. Now, these points that show up on the screen are kind of standard, not default locations, but they're common locations that are chosen for setting up an origin inside of your BobCAM. So there's points all over the place. Again, a big thing with this is make sure that down here under our filters, you have at least point turned on. If you don't have point turned on, it doesn't allow you to go in and pick those points properly. So if I uncheck that, and this is the first thing I ran into, it wouldn't let me pick those points. So what I had to do is just make sure to turn on my point filters there. And then now I can pick whatever point I want. All right. You also have different options for quadrants, your grid snap, all that kind of stuff. And because my part's 6x6, a grid snap would work as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just choose this point back here, as this would represent where my solid jaw is. I have my X direction moving this way. I have my Y direction moving away from the part there. And so that works out pretty good. Now, if I'm using this on a mill, I'm primarily going to be touching off the top of the part. So this surface that I'm zeroing from would be my zero location. If I was using maybe a router, maybe I'd pick this bottom left-hand corner here, and it would be at the bottom of the part because I'm zeroing off the spoil board on a router. Some routers, you may not have to do this, but some routers, you might be going off the spoil board. So you have to remember that the top of feature would now be 3.5 inches tall. And so when we start toolpathing, we need to make sure that our origin is referenced properly. Basically, what we're choosing right now is the location that is shared between this selection that we're picking now and the selection that we're going to have at the machine. We're going to walk out to the machine and we're going to either probe off this corner or we're going to touch off our tools off of that corner. And that's how between BobCAM and your machine, they communicate the same locations. You're setting up your work offset. Now in here, if we scroll down, let me move this thing over a little bit here. We can modify the direction that this thing's pointing in. So we could flip X, Y, and Z into different orientations. We also have our work offset values. So down here, I have my work offset number. 1 is always going to be the equivalent to your first work offset. So if I'm using a standard machine that uses, say, G54, then I'd leave it at 1. If I wanted to do G55, I'd go to 2. G56 would be 3. Your machine may call them E1, E2, E3. They're just whatever your machine labels as work offsets. It's your first, your second, your third, and then depending on your post processor, it'll define how many you can have. So I have 26 available. So I'm going to leave that on 1. And then right here for the work offset XYZ, if you have the Machine Simulation Pro, so when you launch the simulation, if you can see the machine inside that simulation, then you're going to want to add a value into your Z so that we lift the part up. This does not affect the G code in any way, shape, or form. It's just for the simulation. If you don't add a Z value in here, your part will be inside the virtual table, and you'll have a bunch of errors telling you that you're machining through your table. So you want to be careful with that. In my case, I'd go ahead and say, let's just stick it up 4 inches as if it was sitting in a vise. And then right here, we have our clearance plane. This is the safe area above everything on your table. So when the tool has to move around, this is the height that it goes to. This is a standard setting. This is a default setting. So it is going to leave it at a 1 inch. But if you don't change this now, you have to go back into this page later on to change it. You won't be able to change the clearance plane based on each feature. This is an overall setting. And when we see it later on, it'll be grayed out and we can't go in and change it. We have to come back to here to actually change that clearance plane. When we're all done, we don't have any more next buttons or any options like that. So we're just going to hit OK. And now I have my stock defined on my part. So now it's actually time that I could start toolpathing this. But before I toolpath most things, I like to blank out the stock. So I'm just going to right click on the word stock here and say blank on blank toolpath. And that kind of covers everything you'll want to know about the stock. And there's a lot to it. If you have to modify how it rotates or how its orientation is set, then you're going to want to look into getting some training and kind of talk about that with one of the trainers, because we can go through and show you how to reorient the stock and how to use different stock options. And that concludes the video on the stock wizard and machine setup from inside of BobCAM for Rhino.